Okay, so in the previous video, we had kind of a quick start to all of this. So to start this video off, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about the class briefly, some of the functions that we have in AActor, such as begin play and tick, things that you did not see in the previous lesson on UObjects. AActor has a begin play function, which is called when your game starts. So I'll quickly mention that again. In future videos, we'll actually explain those and use those in more detail, so you can see those being used in practical examples. Okay, so what I'm also going to do in this video is I'm going to discuss some of the property specifiers. Some of them also apply to U functions, and this can be really confusing. So if you are new to this and you go and look at the documentation, it's not always as clear. You have to kind of look at a few examples to see like what's going on. So I made some slides. Okay, I tried to summarize it in a way, maybe for your notes, to try and make sense, of that. So I'll start with an overview of the AActor class and some of the functions and stuff that come with that. So in the very interesting actor.h file, you can see we have similar things that we've discussed previously in the UObject lesson. So we have pragma ones, for example. We have these includes like core minimal.h. Then we have that .generator.h and so on. Generated body macro, you see all of these macros. We've already talked about uClass as well in the previous video. Okay, so scrolling down a bit, you can see that we have the constructor. This is our custom property that we'll be talking about in more detail in the video. Then we also have this protected section and we have begin play. And one of the main reasons why I kind of skipped this in the previous video was mainly because I wanted to introduce a bunch of things already. And it's kind of obvious here. It says called when the game starts or spawned. And then down here we have something called every frame. Okay, so let's just jump over to the .cpp file here, the source file. Okay, so of course we have the constructor. All right. So nothing particularly difficult here from standard C++. You can see we have this default constructor. One thing here is that you can set this tick. You can set this to true or false. You can turn this off to improve performance if you do not want your actor to tick. So set this actor to call tick every frame. Okay, so if I scroll down, you see tick, this basically again called every frame. Don't worry about this too much at this point. We will come back to this and then we'll actually show you a few examples again as we go through the actor lessons, right? But basically every frame will call this function. Again, if this is set to true. Here we simply again create that object and assign that to root as you have done it in the previous video. So all of that is done in the constructor. Then you'll also see stuff like this. Super begin play. So this is in the begin play function, which is called when the game starts or when spawned. So when this actor is spawned. Okay, so either when it starts or when this actor is spawned. Then it will call super begin play. So this again inherits from something. Okay, this class inherits from something, and that also has the begin play function. And so it will call the parent's version of begin play. That is important so that we don't miss whatever functionality is implemented in the parent function. But in this way, we can also add our own custom functionality to begin play. So that again, it calls the parent version of this function, and then we can also write our own stuff in here. So again, don't worry about begin play too much for right now. For right now, we will primarily use the constructor. So as we've seen in the previous video, it's in the constructor that we will go and initialize our components, or the objects basically, and some of our properties and so on. And the reason why we do it in the constructor and not in begin play is that we want to go and edit some of those properties in what is referred to in editor time. So in other words, our object components will be initialized when the project is run, and then we'll be able to modify some of those components and these, the properties on the details panels and such in the editor. So begin play is used more for stuff again that you want to have happen when the gameplay starts. So when you load up that level, the game is running, you load up that level, then you want stuff to happen. So either when the game starts or as soon as that actor is spawned into the level. Okay, so that's the basic difference. So I want to move on and talk about UProperty specifiers, and we'll start with the visible specifiers. Now, of course, in this lesson, we're not going to talk about every single specifier that you get. We will introduce more and more of them as we go along. But here again, some of the important ones that can get you confused as a beginner. Now, I would like to note that the visible specifiers are incompatible with the edit specifiers that we'll talk about later. So we've seen some of them before, as I mentioned, but in this video, we'll go through them again, okay, in a bit more detail, so as to kind of clear up some of the confusion that you might have. So visible anywhere, that specifier, okay, we have to the left the specifiers and to the right the effect on the property. So visible anywhere, this property is visible in all property windows, but cannot be edited. So you can see the property. So let's say you have a health, an integer, you can see what the value is, but you cannot edit that. Okay, you have to go back to C++, for example, or use blueprint logic to go and manipulate that value. We'll talk about that in more detail later. Then I have visible defaults only, and this property in that case is only visible in property windows for arts types and cannot be edited. So you might ask, like, what is an arts type? Well, this is basically the class, okay? So let's say we have this actor again, very interesting actor that is written in C++. You go and create a blueprint that derives from that, and now you can edit the defaults of that. Okay, you open up the blueprint, you will see the properties. In the details window, you'll see the properties. Then you can see that, the properties of the class. You cannot edit them, but you can see them. So visible anywhere, that will be the case. When you open up the blueprint editor, you can see the properties in that editor as well as on an instance. So if you drag out an instance and you have it selected, similar thing happens, you can see it, but you cannot edit it. Then you have visible instance only. Now that is kind of different, because even if you have the blueprint opened up for that class, for that arts type, basically, you cannot go and see what the defaults are. But if you drag out an instance in the world, and you have it selected, then you can see on that particular instance what the value is for that property. So let's just take a look at an example in Unreal Engine. I'll start by declaring a new property. And I'll call this health, and it's an int 32. Now, if you are unsure, just use int 32. For the most part, that will be fine. Again, in the previous lesson on uObjects, I used uint 8. Now, it will depend on what you want to do. All right. So don't worry about it too much. You can also use float, but because I want this to be whole numbers like 10 or 100 or something like that, I'm using integers. So we want to expose this to the reflection system. So we need UProperty, and I'm going to paste that visible anywhere right in here. So we'll come back to components. So the important thing to notice is that this is a pointer, whereas this is regular variable, and we are exposing that to the reflection system, and we are passing this macro here, this specifier, visible anywhere. So health, in the constructor here, I'll set health to something like 100. I'll go and compile this. Okay, the compile is complete, and I can drag an instance of the C++ class. I can drag an instance of that in my world, and you can see under this very interesting actor section that the health variable shows up, and it's set to 100. Now you can left click in here and try and change that. You cannot change that, so it's not editable, but it is visible on the instance. So I'll delete that, and in the blueprints, I'll drag and drop an instance of the blueprint, very interesting actor. I'll drag and drop that into my world. You can see this still has that sphere. Now I have the actor selected, and again you have this drop down. You'll see health, again set to 100. You cannot edit that. Okay, you can open up the blueprint for that. You will see that if I have that selected, you will see again under this category here, these are categories. You'll see under very interesting actor, health variable set to 100. You cannot edit this. So this is like the class defaults. Okay, if you change this, close that off, double click on it. Again, this will open up the class defaults. So you change the defaults for each instance of this. So each one you drag in from here will create an instance. And each one of those instances will have the values that you set on here, okay, in this section. This is almost like writing functionality in C++, but instead of doing that in C++, we are specifying various variables and things that you can add in here and default values. Okay, this is similar to setting stuff in the constructor in C++, but instead we are doing it in blueprints. Not quite the same, but you get the idea. And you can see that in both cases, both on the instance and on the arch type or the class defaults, we can see, it's visible, but we cannot edit it. Later on in the video, we'll see how we can add our own custom categories and even subcategories. But by default, it uses the class name. So again, very interesting actor. It will use that by default. It also separates out the words. So you can say very interesting actor. It spaces those out with spaces. That is for readability. Okay, so this is great and everything. Let's go back to the header file here in Visual Studio, and we can change this to visible defaults only. And now what should happen is as soon as I click compile, the instance that I have right here, this should go away on the instance. It will only be visible right here on the class defaults, all right? It will be visible here, but not on the instance. So I'll click compile. You can see that disappears now on the instance. If it does not do that the first time, you can always compile again or close the unroll editor and then build it then and open it up again. So just a note that sometimes that does happen. I'll open the blueprint editor again, and you can see on the class defaults here, we still have this section and we have the health. This is visible. So you can kind of see what's going on here. I'll change this to visible instance only. And of course, what will happen now is this will go away on the class defaults, but on the instance, we'll see that again. Okay, so I'll just go and compile this. As you can see, compile is complete. We can see this health variable again in the details panel here per instance. If I go to the class here, blueprint editor, you'll see that does not show up anymore. Okay, so I'm taking it really slow here. I probably don't have to show you each specifier, demo each specifier, but I'm doing it anyway to try and help you, avoid some of that confusion. Especially if you're not English, maybe you don't really get what an instance is. You don't really get like what the class defaults are just yet. Again, I'd rather take the time and I try and explain this stuff and show it to you so that we can kind of move on, okay? So next we have the edit specifiers. Now the visible specifiers was quite easy. This is where it gets a bit more confusing, and especially once you start mixing this stuff with some of the blueprint specifiers that we'll see later. Now again, these specifiers are incompatible with the visible specifiers. You have edit anywhere. Now this property can be edited by property windows, so on arch types and on instances. You can edit it anywhere. Edit defaults only. This property can be edited by property windows, but only on arch types. Class defaults basically. Okay, so in the blueprint editor, for example, then you have edit instance only. So the effect that this will have is the property can be edited by property windows again, but only on instances, not on arch types. So the basic rule of thumb is to use visible specifiers when you use a pointer property that points to a component. So as we've seen in the previous video, okay, so that's why I used visible anywhere. Now if you use these edit specifiers, this will allow you to change the pointer value. So basically what the pointer is pointing at. This can cause all kinds of problems. So the basic rule of thumb is to use visible specifiers again when you use a pointer property that points to a component. Okay, back in Visual Studio in the header file, previously we've seen that so the visible something, visible instance or visible anywhere, for example, we can see these like in the details panels and such, but we cannot edit those. So of course we want to edit anywhere, for example, that specifier. I'll compile this, and this block here should now become editable. It will be both visible and editable with this specifier. Compile complete, and now you can see I can edit this. So now I can change that on a per instance basis. So 50, can drag out another instance, set that to 20. You can see I can change that, but the default remains 100 because that is it in C++. Okay, and this again derives from that. But if I go to the blueprint, so my very interesting actor underscore blueprint again, the class defaults, you can see that this is set in C++, of course, but I can edit the defaults here in blueprints. So on this particular blueprint, you can go and create multiple variations of this thing, so each inheriting from very interesting actor. Okay, so you can have very interesting actor 1, 2, 3, and so forth. And for each one of those, you can go and set the default for that blueprint. So let's just do 50, for example. Okay, now if I compile this and save, this guy was 100 before, it's now 50. This guy is 20, that guy is 50 as well. If I drag out another instance, you'll see that is 50. Each instance will now have 50, okay? Because again, I've set that on the arts type, so the class default again is now 50. You can revert this, and that's because again this is set or inherited from C++ to be 100. So you can reset that right here if you want to do that. Compile and save, and now you can see these will be 100. The other ones will retain the values that we've set. So but the point is, edit anywhere. We can edit on a per instance basis, and we can edit the class defaults basically for that blueprint. Okay, you can see where I'm going with this. Edit defaults only, and this will again mean that I can change the defaults for the blueprint class right here, but not on a per instance basis. So I can compile this, and this should go away. It won't be visible because that's not specified, but we can change the defaults for that blueprint class. You can see that now goes away, but again, with the blueprint open, I can go and change the default right here. Okay, if I want to do that, again, I'll open up Visual Studio, and I can change this to instance only. Now that will show up, as you can expect, per instance, but I will not be able to go and change the blueprint class defaults. So this will go away. You can see that goes away, but we can now change that again on a per instance basis. So, but the more complicated example comes in where I have where you combine various things, and also where you use those with components. So here we have this pointer, and so what I want to do is I want to change this from visible anywhere to edit anywhere. I can choose some of the other edit specifiers as well, but in this case I'll just choose edit anywhere, for example, and I'll show you like why you don't typically want to do this. So back in Unreal Editor here, I'll go into the blueprint, and the specifiers that I change relate to the scene component. Okay, Visual Studio, this again relates to the scene component that we did in the previous video. And you can see as it is currently, okay, where it is visible only, like before I compile, you can see the details show up right here. Alright, so what I'll do is I'll compile this. Back in the blueprint, I also have that component selected. And now you can see in the details panel, this kind of looks really weird. You might have to click this drop down to get these. And you'll see to the right of this, so this is the variable root. You have to remember that again, this is a pointer, and we've marked that as edit something, so we can edit that in the editor. So basically we can change what this points to, because you have to remember the other variables. So health, for example, we can set what is stored in that variable. So when it comes to the pointer, we can basically change like where that, or kind of what that points to. So it's a bunch of things. You can also click on this and then you can basically see what is on that component. So this currently does point to a scene component, and because that is set up in C++, okay, that object shows up and the settings show up on that. So transform, you can set the transform on here. Now this would be similar to setting this in C++, kind of hard coding in C++, location, rotation, or whatever is available on that particular component. So in this case, again, it's a scene component. It can be something else like a mesh, for example, as we'll see in the next video. But in this case, it's a scene component. You can set the defaults here. So Z, for example, I'll do 50, and then I'll compile and save this. And then I'll select one of these instances. Okay, if you drag and drop them into the world, they get some location. I'll left click to reset that, and you'll see it goes to 0, 0, and 50. That's because it is set to that. If I left click on that in the transform, it's basically like set up to be like that. So I don't really recommend that you do it this way. You can, okay, if you want. And it's nice that you have this functionality. I would like to also note, you can see right here the parent class. You can hover here, of course, or you can see right here the parent class. Okay, so this is one reason why we don't use edit. So edit anywhere, edit instance, or any of that stuff. Okay, you can see even on the instance, per instance, you can change what this thing points to basically. You have to remember it's a pointer. So change this to visible anywhere instead. And when I compile, you will see that this will completely change. Now, just because this is visible anywhere, typically when it's visible, we cannot edit it, but that relates to the variable right here. So in other words, we cannot edit the variable, the defaults of the variable. In this case, is a pointer. So in other words, we cannot edit what that points to, but that does not mean we cannot change what shows up, the properties on that component that shows up. So here you can see you have transform and various other things. So you can still edit the defaults, but you don't now have the problem where you can accidentally change what that pointer is pointing to. Okay, so that's a difference. So again, the rule of thumb is when you use components or pointers that point to some component basically, then you want to use visible. When you use normal variables like int or float and such, then you can use edit. Okay. Okay, so in this next section, we'll be talking about the blueprint specifiers. We've seen some of those before, so in the UObject lesson, but in this case, I'll talk about those again in a bit more detail. So I have a few notes here, like how you can remember, like what's the difference. So the edit specifiers refers to the editor. So details panels, again, changing blueprint class defaults. Blueprint specifiers refers to blueprint visual scripting. So if you want to get or set variables and use them in your blueprint logic, okay, that's basically the difference. And I use the asterisk here to basically refer to all of the specifiers that relate to blueprint, and the same with the edit. So edit instance only, edit anywhere, stuff like that. So all of those. So again, edit refers to the editor, changing default values, changing values in the details panel. Blueprint refers again to working with variables and stuff in blueprint visual scripting. So in the graph, for example. Okay, so here we have the blueprint specifiers. These are incompatible with one another, so you use one or the other, okay, but not both. And these specifiers will basically give us setter and getter functions, so we don't necessarily have to go and write functions to do that. So you might remember in C++ you'd typically go and write functions, so setter and getter functions, to go and write or get values on your properties or on your member variables, as opposed to changing those directly. But here these specifiers help us out. Now there are a few more of these that I'll cover in future videos, but for now we'll just talk about these two. So again, we have blueprint read only. The property can be read by blueprints but not modified. Then of course you have read-write, where the property can be read or written from a blueprint. In other words, you can read the value to a getter, and you can also set the value in your blueprint graphs. So we've seen examples of the blueprint specifiers previously in the UObjects lesson. So blueprint read-write, blueprint read-only. Okay, we've seen what those do previously. But it's important to look at how we can combine some of these specifiers. Now, I would like to note that some specifiers are incompatible, as we've seen. So we have UProperty, visible anywhere, and blueprint read-write. This is one example. I'm not going to do like all of the combinations. I just want to give you an idea and, so that you can start thinking about these combinations. So visible anywhere, again, what does that mean? It means that this property is visible in all property windows, so on the details panels, again on a per instance basis. So each instance you can see, it's visible in the details panel, as well as when you open up that blueprint class, it's visible in the details panel, but it cannot be edited, whether again it's on an instance or the class defaults. So it's visible, but it's not editable. But let's say we want to edit that via blueprint visual scripting. Well, we can then specify a blueprint read-write, and now this property can be read or written from the visual scripting system. So even though it's not editable in the details panels, whether that's again on an instance or the class defaults, we can still use the visual scripting system to go and get or set that property. So this is how we can start to use these in combination. So I've removed all of those instances from my scene. I'll go back to Visual Studio, and we have this health variable, okay, this health property. So I'll change this to visible anywhere, and I'll go and compile that. I'll switch over to the blueprint editor, and with this here selected, again, if you have something else selected, the details for that selected thing will populate. Here we want to select the actor itself, and here again we can set the defaults for this blueprint class. You should see this section again, very interesting actor, the health variable, and the default value will show up for that. Okay, so sometimes we don't want our variables, the defaults that are set in C++ in some base class, to be changeable or editable basically in child classes. So in this case, this blueprint class, we want them to be visible but not editable in some cases. That is on the class defaults or on a per instance basis. So in this case, maybe you want them to be again visible but not editable. Okay, at the same time, you want to give the programmer that is going to use blueprint visual scripting the ability to get the values. So in this case, we want to get what the health is, okay, because we want to use it in visual scripting. Since we cannot change the defaults here, you also want to give a setter function so that we can set from visual scripting what that variable is. And that might happen here in begin play. We use some of these events. So even though again you cannot set the defaults on an instance basis or on the class defaults, but you can then again still set via visual scripting or get that variable. So how can we do that? Well, currently this is only visible. So what we can do is, again, in the U property here for health, we can do and this depends on what you want to do. Do you want to read only, or you also want to write? So in this case, I can read and write, blueprint read write. So I compile this. And I would like to note here that if you have show inherited variables on, that variable will now show up in here. So we have components, we have the sphere. So our health variable should also show up in here once that is complete, and you can see that will once again be categorized under very interesting actor, which is the class name, because we have not set up a custom category for that just yet. You can see our health variable shows up now. Now I can go and get that health. I can also go and set that health. And if you right click, you can also search for this. You can search health, variables, very interesting actor. You can customize that. We'll look at that shortly. As I mentioned, you can get and set. So again, in this case, we cannot set the default for this class or per instance, but what we can do is we can set, okay, so event begin play, and then we set the health to what? Well, let's say 50, for example. I'll compile and save. Remember, you can click this drop down and then you can do save on compile, on success only, for example, or always. Okay, you have that option. So I'll go back and I'll drag and drop an instance into my world of this blueprint. Okay, I'll just save all and I'll click play. And what I'll do is I'll eject, and with this instance selected, you can see that the health shows up, and that is 50. Okay, that is set to 50. As soon as I stop, that should revert. So I'll stop, navigate around a bit, select, and you see the health is 100. As soon as I click play, eject, and have that selected, you see 50. That is set using begin play to 50. So I can delete that. I can also do print string, and now I get that health variable, and I'll print that. I would like to note in this case that I'll click on this drop down, and then I'll select new editor window. So this is not a standalone game. This is still play in editor, but it's going to give us a new editor windows, and sometimes in the viewport you can get stuff, show up that's in the way. So in this case I prefer to use the new editor window, and you'll see that will print that out. Okay, we get 100. So what we can do is we can set that first to something like 20, and then we can print it. And you'll see it'll print 20. Okay, so I'm kind of spending a lot of time on this. I'm just trying to highlight the fact that you'll see some of these combinations in other people's code, and it can be confusing, like why they're using all of these different specifiers kind of together, right? So again, here you set the defaults for this class. This is a blueprint class that derives from a C++ class called very interesting actor. If you want to set the defaults or have the defaults be editable, then you would use edit. If you only want to have them be visible, then you use visible. And in the case where you use visible only, whether that is anywhere or whatever the case, regardless of that, you can still use some of the other specifiers such as blueprint read write to still go and get and set that variable. Now the final specifier that I'd like to talk about in this video is the category specifier. Now this is used to categorize our properties and functions, so it's not just for UProperty. The specifier is category equals and then some string. Now you can see you can also define nested categories using that vertical bar operator. Okay, so before moving on, I'll just go and delete what I've written here in the blueprint graph. File and save that, and I'll just go and save all. Okay, so back in Visual Studio, I want a few more properties. I'm going to delete this here, and I'll set this to edit anywhere. I'll create a few copies, call that armor, and maybe I'll do one more. Something like intelligence, maybe. Okay, so I basically have a few properties that would relate to a character or something like that. Currently, I'm only specifying edit anywhere for these properties. So I'll go and set the defaults for these. Of course, you can choose the American or international spelling for armor. Doesn't really matter. Just an example. And I'm just choosing random values for this: health, armor, strength, and intelligence. Now, as I mentioned previously, the class very interesting actor, that will be used for the category by default because we have not specified any categories, any custom categories. So I'll bring up the editor and compile this. Okay, and with that actor selected, again under very interesting actor, you will see those show up. They are editable and they are all under this kind of default category. Okay, so I'll go back to Visual Studio and we can specify a custom category for this. We pass this a string and let's just call this attributes. Of course, I want these all to have that. So I'll just go and paste that in. We will leave the component as is for now. We'll continue with that in the next video. So all of these will now be under a custom category called attributes. Okay, I'll compile that. And you'll see this drop-down shows up now called attributes instead of very interesting actor. And you can see all of these are now grouped underneath this category. Now I would like to mention again that I have this instance of this my very interesting actor blueprint class, and you can see the same thing happens in this detail panel per instance. Okay, all of those show up in here as well. Just wanted to kind of reiterate that. Okay, so I'll go back to Visual Studio again, and now we can add subcategories using this vertical bar. Maybe I have health and armor. Both of those are kind of the same thing. Once your armor is depleted, your health will start to deplete. I'll do both of these in a health section. Whereas some of the rest, so strength, intelligence, and so forth, you can probably do dexterity and so on, I will do in a core subsection. A few other things you can think about is vitality or mana or whatever is required for your game or whatever it is that you want to, go with. This is just an example. Bring up Unreal Editor again and I'll compile this. And now you can see, again, I have that instance selected. You have this attributes drop down, this attributes category. And now you can see you have these two subcategories as well. So I can click on health and my health and the armor shows up. Can change those because they are editable. And core as well. So again, you can have strength, intelligence, whatever else you want here. Again, depending on your needs. So this is cool. Again, it's really quick and easy to do. And it's all thanks to those specifiers and the macros, the reflection system that enables this. Of course, the class defaults for this, my very interesting actor blueprint, you'll see again with that selected in the details panel. Scroll down somewhere, you should see this attributes and you'll see the same thing. Okay, you have these main category and then you have subcategories as well. Previously, we've seen that if I have this enabled, show inherited variables, alright, then those variables showed up in the variable section, but they would show up under the default category, very interesting actor or something like that. Okay, that default category. So currently we do not see, other than the component, okay, this sphere component, we do not see those variables. And you can actually go and right click and search. You see those do not show up. That's because they have not been made available here. Okay, so let's just do that again in the header file. I'll scroll down. Now it might bother you that this is health and this is health as well, so maybe change this to vitality or something like that. Again, I'm not going to spend too much time on this, mainly because this is a quick demo, okay? I'm not actually going to use this for something. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to set this here. Something like blueprint read write. And maybe I'll do the same thing for armor. And for strength here, I'll do something like blueprint read only. I'm not going to be bothered by intelligence. So you can see that I have category to the right here. That makes it easy to like see that. Okay, we know that to the right we'll always see like what category that is in and stuff like that. Okay, so basic C++ readability also applies to this stuff. Okay, so I'm going to back in the Unreal Editor here, and I'll just compile that. And once that's finished compiling, those variables should show up right here again. As you can see, under attributes, we have this drop down now that shows up once that's finished compiling. Now we have health and core. You can see that I only have strength, and that's because, again, in Visual Studio, we did not specify blueprint read only or blueprint read write for intelligence. So only strength will show up. And if I drag that in, I can get strength, but I cannot set it. You can see. Now health and armor, I can both get and set. Either one of those. Because again of blueprint read write. And again we have this nesting going on. So we have attributes, then health and core. Okay. So this is a really easy way of keeping things organized. Okay, another thing I'd like to mention with regards to categories, I can right click and then I can scroll down to variables. If I click this now, that's drop down, you will see a bunch of those show up. You have actor, you have various things that relate to the actor. Okay, this is inherited stuff. But you can see we also have attributes. Okay, and these, as you can see, is categorized inside of this context menu, right? So how cool is that? As you can see, we can get armor or health and set armor and health, and we can only get strength, so we cannot set strength. Okay, so you can do it from here or from here. So as you can see, the categories are very useful, not only for setting class defaults and organizing it in here, but they also show up depending on what you have set here. So if you have it set to blueprint read write or read only, for example, again, they'll also show up in your variable section, and they'll also show up in the context menu. Again, on the variables, you have attributes. So very useful way of organizing stuff. Of course, you don't have to scroll down and do that stuff. You can just do search, for example, and then you can see you can get health or set health, for example, armor and all that stuff. You can just search. So you can use this functionality all over the place. It's not just for actors. You can do this for pawns, for example, and various other things. So I just decided that I'm going to make this extra video to try and cover this stuff, so that, again, to try and help you avoid some confusion. There are a few other ones, all right, that we'll cover in future videos, but this covers the basics, the basic ones that we'll be using for the most part. All right, so I'll see you in the next video.